Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore tales of courage, compassion, and the power of human connection. Today, we bring you a riveting story of a Marine who trusted his instincts and stepped in when it mattered most. Join us as we uncover a journey of bravery, resilience, and a life saved through a simple yet powerful act of kindness. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the rural stretch of highway that seemed to stretch endlessly across the countryside. The Emberfield Diner, a modest rest stop nestled between miles of farmland, offered solace to weary travelers. It was a place of quiet simplicity, where time seemed to move a little slower, and where the hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the occasional clatter of cutlery. On this particular day, it was also the backdrop for an encounter that would forever alter the lives of those involved. Ethan Carter, a Marine recently returned from active duty, stepped into the diner seeking a brief respite. His broad shoulders and firm posture spoke of his years of discipline, while his weary eyes hinted at the burden of memories he carried. The world outside the battlefield had its own set of challenges, and Ethan often found himself grappling with the transition back to civilian life. As he stepped through the door, the cool air of the diner greeted him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the late autumn sun. Ethan's sharp instincts, honed over years of service, kicked in the moment he entered. His eyes scanned the room, a habit he couldn't shake even in the most mundane of settings. A few truckers sat at the counter, sipping coffee and sharing stories, while an elderly couple shared a piece of pie in a corner booth. It was a scene of quiet normalcy, yet something felt out of place. It was then that he noticed them, a young black girl, no older than 8, and an older white man seated in a booth near the window. The girl, dressed in a bright red dress, was a stark contrast to the muted tones of the diner. Her curly hair framed a face that should have radiated innocence, but instead held a shadow of unease. Her hands fidgeted restlessly in her lap, her wide eyes darting around the room as if searching for something or someone. Seated across from her was a man in a navy blue suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. He held a newspaper in front of him, but Ethan noticed how his eyes frequently peered over the top, fixated on the girl with a gaze that felt too intense to be paternal. Ethan's military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him something was wrong. Yet, he hesitated. The disparity in their ages and races could have an innocent explanation. Perhaps the man was her guardian or a family friend. Ethan ordered a coffee, hoping the simple act would clear his mind, but his unease only grew. As he waited at the counter, Ethan's gaze returned to the pair. The girl's movements were subtle but deliberate. Her small hand rose, fingers spread in a gesture so fleeting that it could have been dismissed as a nervous tic. But to Ethan, it looked deliberate, a silent cry for help. His heart tightened as he met her gaze. If only for a second, there was a depth of emotion in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine, a combination of fear and desperation that he couldn't ignore. Positioning himself near the vending machines, Ethan sipped his coffee, watching without appearing to. The girl seemed to shrink under the man's gaze, her shoulders hunched, her tiny frame folding into itself. The man's demeanor remained calm, even casual, but there was an air of control about him that unsettled Ethan further. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something deeply wrong. Yet doubt lingered. What if he was overreacting? What if he misread the situation and caused unnecessary distress? Ethan's inner conflict was interrupted when the girl made the same hand gesture again, this time more pronounced. Her eyes met his, filled with an unmistakable plea for intervention. It was enough to erase Ethan's doubts. His instincts flared to life, and he reached for his phone, dialing 911 with calm urgency. "This is Ethan Carter," he said, his voice steady but tense. "I'm at Emberfield Diner on Route 27. There's a young black girl, about 8 years old, with an older white man in a navy suit. I believe she's signaling for help. Something isn't right." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, instructing him to stay safe and not engage directly. Ethan hung up, his eyes never leaving the pair. He positioned himself near the exit, ready to act if the man tried to leave before the police arrived. His heart raced, not with fear, but with the familiar adrenaline of someone about to step into the unknown. The minutes felt like hours as Ethan watched the pair. The man leaned in toward the girl, his expression calm, but his words too quiet to hear. Whatever he said made her tense visibly, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to wait. He had no proof, no authority to intervene directly, but he was ready to act if the moment called for it. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tense silence. Relief flooded Ethan as two police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. He stepped outside, waving the officers down and quickly briefing them on the situation. She signaled for help twice. He emphasized, "I'm certain something is wrong." The officers nodded, their faces set with determination. As they approached the diner, Ethan followed closely behind. The quiet sanctuary of the rest stop was about to erupt into a confrontation that would change everything. The sirens, once distant echoes, now blared through the parking lot as two police cars came to a stop in front of the diner. Their flashing lights cast blue and red hues across the dimly lit lot, breaking the quiet monotony of the rest stop. Inside the diner, heads turned as the officers exited their vehicles, their purposeful strides radiating authority. Ethan Carter, standing just outside the door, quickly briefed the lead officer, recounting every detail he had observed. "She's scared," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "The way she looked at me, the gestures, it's not just in my head. Something's happening, and she's in danger." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable but focused. "Stay here," he instructed, motioning for his partner to follow as they entered the diner. Ethan watched as the officers stepped inside, their presence instantly altering the atmosphere. The few patrons who remained seemed to hold their breath, their casual conversations replaced by a tense silence. The older man in the Navy suit, who Ethan now knew to be Greg Alden, froze as the officers approached. His mask of composure faltered for a brief second before he forced a strained smile, his grip tightening on the girl's wrist. "Sir," one of the officers said, his tone firm but polite, "we need to ask you a few questions. Can you step outside with us for a moment?" Greg's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, officers," he replied smoothly. "But may I ask what this is about? My niece and I are just grabbing a quick bite before continuing our trip." The officer's eyes flicked toward the young girl. "Is that right?" he asked gently, directing his question to her. His voice softened, his demeanor shifting to something more reassuring. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The girl, now visibly trembling, opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly clamped it shut. Her wide, frightened eyes darted to Greg, who gave her wrist a subtle squeeze. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to silence her. Ethan, still watching from the door, felt his fists clench involuntarily. He had seen that look before, the look of someone too terrified to speak, trapped under the weight of control. His military instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he held back, trusting the officers to handle the situation. "Sir," the second officer said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I'm going to have to insist you step outside. We've received a report about suspicious behavior, and we need to verify a few things." Greg's friendly facade began to crack. His smile tightened, and a bead of sweat formed at his temple. "Suspicious behavior," he echoed, his tone tinged with incredulity. "I don't understand. Is it because I look different from my niece? That's outrageous." The lead officer didn't waver. "This isn't about appearances," he said. "We just need to ensure everything is as it seems. Please, step outside." Greg hesitated, his grip on the girl's wrist tightening. The tension in the diner was palpable, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Finally, he stood, pulling the girl with him. She stumbled slightly, her small frame struggling to keep up with his hurried movements. As Greg began to move toward the door, the girl did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She raised her hand, palm outward, her fingers spread wide, a clear and deliberate signal. Her eyes locked with Ethan's, and the desperation in her gaze was unmistakable. "She's signaling," Ethan shouted, stepping forward. His voice was a thunderclap that shattered the diner's tense silence. The officers reacted immediately. "Let her go," the lead officer barked, his hand moving to his holster. Greg froze, his eyes darting between the officers and Ethan. His grip on the girl didn't loosen, but his facade crumbled completely. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice rising in panic. "She's my niece. I'm just taking care of her. Let her go now," the second officer commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Greg's defiance faltered under their combined authority. With a frustrated growl, he released the girl's wrist, shoving her forward slightly as if to prove his compliance. The lead officer stepped in immediately, placing himself between Greg and the child while his partner moved to restrain the man. "Sir, you're under arrest," the officer said, pulling out handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg's protests were loud and frantic as he was led outside, his voice echoing in the now silent diner. "You're making a mistake. This is all a misunderstanding." Inside, the young girl stood motionless, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something or someone she could trust. Ethan approached her cautiously, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "Hey," he said softly, his voice gentle but steady. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. My name's Ethan. Can you tell me yours?" She hesitated, her lip trembling, but then whispered, "Zoe. Zoe." Ethan repeated with a small, reassuring smile. "That's a beautiful name. You did the right thing. Zoe, you were so brave." Her wide eyes filled with tears, and before Ethan could react, she threw her arms around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world of chaos. He froze for a moment, then gently wrapped his arms around her, murmuring words of comfort. The officers returned, their expressions grim but relieved. "We're taking him in for questioning," the lead officer said. "We'll also need to take statements and figure out what's going on. Can you accompany us to the station?" Ethan nodded, still holding Zoe. "Of course," he replied. "I'll do whatever it takes to help." As they exited the diner together, the night air felt heavier, weighted by the realization of what had just unfolded. Zoe's small hand clutched Ethan's tightly as they walked toward the police car, her trust in him unspoken but clear. For Ethan, it was a moment of clarity, a reminder that the fight for justice didn't always happen on battlefields. Sometimes, it was in the quiet corners of the world, where someone needed to step up and do the right thing. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast a sterile glow over the bustling room, where officers moved with purpose. Phones rang incessantly, and the hum of printers filled the background. Amid the controlled chaos, Zoe sat in a chair near one of the desks, her small frame dwarfed by its size. She clutched a mug of hot chocolate, her tiny hands barely able to wrap around it. As she stared into the swirling liquid, her face was pale, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Ethan stayed close, seated a few feet away, his watchful eyes never leaving her. He felt a protective instinct toward the girl, a deep need to ensure her safety. He had faced danger countless times during his military service, but this felt different. This was personal. Zoe had trusted him with her silent plea for help, and he wasn't going to let her down. As the officers worked, piecing together the fragmented story of Greg, Alden, and Zoe, a commotion at the entrance caught Ethan's attention. The door burst open, and a man rushed inside, his face a mixture of desperation and hope. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes burned with determination. "Zoe," the man called out, his voice cracking with emotion. Zoe's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto him. The mug slipped from her hands, spilling hot chocolate onto the floor, but she didn't care. "Daddy," she cried, her voice high and trembling with relief. She leaped from the chair and ran to him, her small feet barely touching the ground. The man dropped to his knees, catching her in his arms and holding her tightly. "Oh, Zoe," he whispered, his voice choked with tears. I've been so worried about you. You're safe now. Sweetheart, you're safe." The room seemed to pause as officers and staff alike turned to witness the reunion. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the father and daughter cling to each other, their relief and love palpable. This moment, this raw, unfiltered emotion was why he had acted, why he had followed his instincts. Zoe pulled back slightly, her small hands gripping her father's shoulders. "I was so scared, Daddy," she said, her voice trembling. "He said he was going to take me away. He wouldn't let me call you." Her father's face darkened, a mixture of anger and sorrow. "He won't hurt you again, Zoe," he promised, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." Ethan stood silently, giving them the space they needed, but Zoe turned to him, her teary eyes filled with gratitude. "This is him, Daddy," she said, pointing to Ethan. "He helped me. He saved me." Zoe's father looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. For a moment, he said nothing, but the weight of his emotions was clear. He stood, keeping one arm around Zoe, and extended his hand. "Ethan Carter, right?" he asked, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I heard the officers mention your name. I can't thank you enough. You saved my little girl." Ethan shook his hand, his grip firm but humble. "I just did what anyone should do," he said quietly. "She's the brave one. She signaled for help. I just listened." Zoe's father nodded, his eyes glistening. "Well, you listened when no one else did. You acted when others might have walked away. That means everything to me." The officers approached, their somber expressions softening slightly as they addressed Zoe's father. "Mr. Reynolds, we've confirmed that Greg Alden was acting in concert with your ex-wife. They plan to take Zoe out of the country, evading the custody agreement. He's been arrested, and we're pursuing charges against both of them. For now, Zoe is safe, and she'll be going home with you." Reynolds tightened his grip on Zoe, his jaw clenching as he processed the information. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but heartfelt. "Thank you for stopping them." The lead officer nodded. "You have Ethan Carter to thank for that. If he hadn't trusted his instincts, things might have turned out very differently." Zoe's father turned back to Ethan, his gratitude deepening. "I don't know how to repay you," he said earnestly, "but if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, you just let me know." Ethan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything. Seeing her safe, that's all the thanks I need." As the hours passed, formalities were handled, and statements were given. Zoe's demeanor began to shift, the weight of the evening slowly lifting from her small shoulders. By the time they were ready to leave, she even managed a shy smile. Outside the station, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Zoe clung to her father's hand, her steps lighter than they had been all night. Before they got into their car, she turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "You're my hero." Ethan crouched to her level, his smile gentle. "You're the hero, Zoe. You were brave when it mattered most. Don't ever forget that." With one final hug, Zoe climbed into the car, her father following close behind. As they drove away, Ethan stood in the parking lot, watching until their taillights disappeared into the distance. A sense of peace settled over him, knowing that Zoe was going home to where she belonged. The sun continued to rise, warming the cold morning air. Ethan took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Life had a way of putting him in the right place at the right time, even when he least expected it. Tonight had been a reminder that heroism didn't always happen on a battlefield. Sometimes, it was found in small, quiet moments of courage and compassion. As Ethan turned to head to his car, he knew this experience would stay with him. It was a story of second chances, of trusting instincts, and of the profound impact one person could have on another's life. And for that, he was grateful. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of heroism and hope. If this story moved you as much as it did us, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Remember, one act of compassion can change a life forever. Don't miss our next inspiring tale. Click here to watch and continue the journey of empathy with us. See you next time.